for some updates.
Thank you, Rose. Can you all hear me okay? Great. It's nice to see you after our August break, and now we're back into September, and for some of us in the swing of things with kids in school and back to the routine. So it's really nice to see you all and have a chance to provide some updates on some things that have occurred in the regulatory space that relate to PSC's work and our ongoing work with you as advisory group members. The first update I wanted to provide relates to our general rate case, which you may have heard about. As you may know, at the beginning of the year, PSC submitted its rate case request to the Utilities and Transportation Commission, seeking an increase in rates to cover both investments we've made in the last couple of years and those that we plan to make over the next couple of years to continue to provide safe, affordable, and reliable service to our customers. The forward-looking investments are something that that will help us in terms of our reaching our necessary investments in clean energy that we've been discussing as part of the CEIP process. You know, as a regulated business, PSC cannot just raise its prices on its own. We're required to submit detailed information about our planned investments and investments we've made to justify the rates that PSC charges its customers. And only after we receive approval from our regulators that PSC's prices or our rates, only then can they be set and executed. The overall process for setting rates is it's a legal proceeding before the commission, and it has testimony that includes lots of data and information about PSC's business. And then organizations that have an interest in the process can participate at the commission as parties to the case. You may have heard in our general rate case, we have reached a tentative settlement agreement, and that settlement includes a list of conditions under which the case can be resolved. And we've reached that with many of the other parties in that rate proceeding, including the public counsel section of the Attorney General's office, which is a section that's assigned by the state to represent the general interest of ratepayers, and this section is always a part of any utility rate case. They are always a party to that proceeding. Other parties include the Commission's own regulatory staff, the Northwest Energy Coalition, who represents a diverse set of environmental stakeholders, and also Front and Centered, who many of you know as a former representative on the EAG last year and an important voice in this conversation. And there were a few other parties to the rate case proceeding as well. So it's a settlement. It still needs to be considered by the commission, and the commission will ultimately make the decision to approve it, to reject it, or to modify the settlement that's before them. And so we're awaiting a decision. We would expect them to issue their decision later on in the year. I will note that there'll be a public comment hearing before the commission where the commissioners will be present, and that's on September 28th, where they'll hold a hearing to discuss the issues in the case and the conditions that are in the settlement. Once the commission makes their decision on the settlement agreement, we're happy to come back to this group if there's interest and tell you more about the outcome and answer your questions. You know, rate making is complicated, so we're thinking maybe this is a separate drop-in session for those of you that want to learn more, so we can just have a little bit more time to focus on the topic and answer questions. So we'll think about that. We'll discuss some approaches with the steering committee and see what makes sense there. The second update I wanted to give you relates to our clean energy implementation plan. As you know, we filed our plan with the help and input of many of you on this advisory group last December. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of where we are in that process. There was a comment period at the first part of this year. And then shortly thereafter, in March, one of the parties requested that our CEIP be what's called adjudicated, which is another way of saying it becomes a formal legal process before the commission. And so the commission set the schedule for this process in the spring. And now our plan is working its way through the steps that were outlined in that schedule. We at PSC filed testimony in support of the plan over the summer, and the other parties who are a part of that legal process, they will file their testimony next month in October. And then under the schedule, we'll have an opportunity to respond in December. And then there is a legal hearing anticipated in late January, early February of 2023. And that's when the commissioners will take action on our clean energy implementation plan shortly thereafter. We would expect a commission order in the March, April timeframe. So in the meantime, PSC also continues to engage in settlement discussions like we did in the rate case with the parties to the clean energy implementation plan proceeding. And we do that in the hopes that just like in the general rate case, perhaps we could reach agreement on some of the issues that are being raised. And if we could, then we could perhaps move forward with a plan being approved a little bit sooner than currently outlined in the commission schedule. If we do reach a tentative settlement agreement, we will come and share that agreement with you when we're able to, and then you'll also have an opportunity to weigh in as part of the commission's review process if you'd like to do so. And so we'll make sure you're aware of that. And then I just finally have to say that once we do have an approved clean energy implementation plan, which we're really excited to get to that point, we're really looking forward to working with you more on how we go about implementing that plan. And the public participation plan is one important part of that. You know, as we think about program design and ways we can best reach the communities that we serve, particularly the named communities, our highly impacted communities and vulnerable populations. So those are a couple of updates there. Before I do a quick flyover of federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, I see G has her hand up. I'll just give I'm getting used to the recording in progress part too. So as we try out this new recording structure. So the other thing I wanted to give a brief update on is with respect to passage of the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. And I just want to note at the outset that it's such an exciting development for helping us meet both our aggressive emission reduction goals and enabling our clean energy plans, and hopefully being able to do those things at a lower cost for our customers. The Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, provides more certainty for utilities and for developers regarding incentives for renewables and battery projects, which is great to see. And we also see it promoting more adoption of electric vehicles, which is another area that we're excited about. One part of the IRA that may be of particular interest to many of you is it establishes 2 new programs aimed at helping low and moderate income housing builders do retrofits and also put more energy efficient appliances into service. I think the 2 programs are to the tune of almost $9 billion. So it's a big investment in that area. And so all of these incentives we hope will help us move forward with our clean energy plans, hopefully at a lower cost to our customers. And so that's a very high level flyover of a very complicated piece of legislation. I really just more wanted to mention it for your awareness, because it's something that we're folding into our analytics, because it really will change kind of how some of these projects pencil out vis-a-vis what we thought they would have cost maybe 9 months or so ago from what we were estimating. So if you have detailed questions right now, my colleague Nate Davern's on the line, but we can also address them offline with you anytime as they come up. So happy to do that. And if there aren't any questions on those things, I'm going to turn it over to Mackenzie, who is going to tell you a little bit more about the Green Power Solar Grant Program and ways to involve you all a bit in that effort.
Okay, thank you. So as Kara mentioned, my name is Mackenzie Martin. I'm a community projects manager in the Clean Energy Solutions team and the project manager over these Green Power Solar grants. So I'll cover a brief overview of what the grants are, our goals in having EAG member involvement, and then determine interest in participation and talk about next steps. So PSC runs an annual grant program for nonprofits, public housing authorities, and tribal entities serving low-income and/or BIPOC community members in our electric service area with the intent of installing new solar projects. So while PSC funds the projects are ultimately owned by the customers themselves. And as a result of the solar installation, customers receive a lower electric bill. So we do expect applicants to articulate in their applications how they plan to either pass on those savings to their low income or BIPOC clients or customers, or how they plan to expand their services to those communities as a result of the utility bill savings. So each year, the grants launch in June and eligible applicants submit their projects by early September, and the latest round closed on September 1st. So the projects are now undergoing a technical feasibility review, but come November, we'll begin our review on the community impact portion of the projects, which, as long as the projects are technically feasible, that community impact piece is the most important rating criteria we consider. So in the past, these projects have been reviewed only by a PSC internal panel, but we know that we may have blind spots in our review process. So in order to learn and grow, we're hoping to have 2 members from the EAG participate in the grant review process this winter. We'd love to have community members input on the projects themselves, and then we're also looking for feedback afterwards on potential improvements to the process as a whole, so we can continue to increase the equity in the process. As for the actual commitment, I would anticipate, about a 1-hour introduction to the process, likely in early October, participation in a 1-hour meeting with the entire review panel to get oriented with the scoring rubric and ask any questions about the scoring process. That would likely occur in November, and then about 3 to 4 hours time spent alone scoring the projects that we did receive. There were 18 this year, and then another 2-hour funding decision meeting in December, in which the whole review panel will convene and make final decisions about which projects will be funded. And there will also likely be some time afterwards pulling together and sharing suggestions for any potential changes you might like to see implemented in the process. So all in all, we're estimating approximately 10 hours across November and December, and we would be compensating participants at a rate of $50 per hour for their time. So in a moment, I'll ask if you're interested in this opportunity. Again, we do have 2 spots, so depending on the level of interest, we'll likely come back to you if you are interested, with an opportunity for you to ask more questions, and with a quick check on our end to also ensure there are no conflicts of interest with you and any of the 18 applications that we did receive this round. So with the knowledge that you're not giving a firm commitment in any way, would anyone who is preliminarily interested in this opportunity raise your hand?
Thank you, Mackenzie. I think we're always interested in having the EAG provide input, and this, I think, is a unique opportunity. So we do hope that we can find a couple of members who are willing to lend their perspectives to this opportunity. This is something that actually, meets the community, on the ground, and we're always looking for resources for the community. So I hope you will. And I see Jenny has a hand up, and Z. So we have 2 members of the EAG right off the bat. So thank you for that interest. Mackenzie, I think you've done well tonight.
Great, thank you. And I will say, if you, after tonight's meeting, if you feel like you are interested, we have some time, so always feel free to reach out as well. But we will be in touch with those who indicated interest, and thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So Kara, I'm going to turn back to you because as we go into our discussion on equity, it'd be great to speak to what we've heard. One other point I wanted to make is that with respect to the IRA, it may well be that we have members of the EAG who are affiliated with organizations that are going to be active in that space, and they may well want to bring to us any updates around activities that they have planned for the execution of the IRA. So if that's the case, please do let us know. All right, Kara, back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Rose. And I realize I skipped over this slide inadvertently as we were going through. So I'm glad to have a chance to come back to this. So as you all know, we try to have this slide a part of every one of our meetings to really reflect back to you what we've heard and recall from the previous meeting, and kind of how we've reflected on and moved forward with that feedback. So one of the themes that we heard at the June EAG meeting, or it may have been the July meeting, but certainly earlier this summer, was around questions around the differences between the Equity Advisory Group and our Low Income Advisory Group, the LIAC. And as we discussed a little bit in that meeting, we do recognize that there is some overlapping in terms of roles amongst our advisory groups. And this is something that we've been reviewing this year with each of our advisory groups, really taking a step back and looking at how they're structured, what their objectives are, and thinking about ways that we can both make improvements where we've certainly heard suggestions from stakeholders and others, and also think about ways that those advisory groups can inform and complement one another. And so specific to the LIAC, as its focus is really focused mostly on programs designed for limited income customers, such as our bill assistance programs. And then one area of crossover, of course, is the bill discount rate, which the Equity Advisory Group played in a really important role last year in advising how that program was shaped. And now that that concept was a part of the PSC's general rate case proposal. And then as we move forward and we see if the proposed settlement agreement that I talked about gets approved, that'll put us in a place where PSC can then start working more with the LIAC and others on some of the details of that program and how it gets designed and implemented. So that's just one example. So the LIAC is really focused a lot on the bill assistance side of things, with that being their primary focus. And of course, this advisory group is really thinking about how we advance equity from a clean electricity planning and implementation lens as one of its primary focus areas. So that's a little bit about the distinction, in case that's helpful. And then, we did also hear, some interest in learning more around the steering committee. We did some follow-up with individual EAG members regarding the steering committee and governance recommendations. And Rose, I think you touched on that early on in the meeting, but if there's anything more that we need to say there, please, I don't think you will be shy about chiming in. And we also heard at the last meeting some interest around, and wanting clarity on stipends for participation in the steering committee, as well as the Equity Forum Planning Committee. And so that is something that, we're supportive of doing as well for those efforts, and happy to talk about that more also.
Yes, Kara, we, I think, have clarified that there will be stipends made available for the Planning Committee and for the Steering Committee. And as we discussed the Equity Forum, there may be some other opportunities, but at this point, we're going to focus on the planning.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think Korea's having some issues with her audio as well. So now it's time for you all to roll up your sleeves. We've really been discussing how best to fully engage the EAG around your mission, which is to help PSC figure out how best to embed equity, as Kara mentioned. We focused on our 3 A's: accessibility, affordability, and accountability. We took your feedback, and what we've tried to do is to sort of co-create a guide. with a shared vocabulary. We've been thinking about how we create a bank or a repository for questions to help guide your conversations and your input going forward. And the whole goal is to create a resource for EAG members, both present and future. We know it's going to be a living effort that will be modified and tweaked as appropriate. Let's go to the next slide, please. When we think about the guide and its components, again, if you look to what is my right side of the screen, where we talk about the 3 A's, the goal is to provide focus on how we access the key areas of this transition to clean energy. We want to seek your advice and also to come up with a series of actions or steps that we can take to address embedding equity. So the goal is to think about, from your perspective, the questions that need to be asked at every turn when it comes to this. And we've also prepared an appendix of some other resources. We know, as an example, UTC is looking at this Seattle Equity Toolkit. The state has an energy strategy. So there are a number of resources for us to consider. Can we move ahead, please? Now, before you have a moment, recognize that this mural is a reflection of your comments so far on the 3 A's. So there's no need for you to try to read it. But I understand that the font is a little challenging, but I think you will see a theme developing here. When we developed the 3 A's, the EAG came back and said, the guiding principle for us will be to find a way to accelerate equity. So that's why you see that in the center. Can we go to and these are your comments. So this is all based on your feedback, a combination of the inaugural EAG and the current EAG. Next slide, please. So in 2021, we developed a set of guiding principles. They are also in your charter. And the importance here is that this is the foundation that PSC will use for moving forward with the CEIP. As Kara mentioned, we are waiting for regulatory approval of the plan that we submitted, but as the EAG continues its work, we're going to focus on the 3 A's. And today in particular, we want to talk about accessibility. Next slide, please. So for accessibility, there are some themes that we discussed: meeting people where they are, making sure that we are considering unique aspects of communities and how they access clean energy or electricity, the ability to increase community participation across all levels of this, and to hopefully encourage a sense of ownership in this process. So that is what we're focusing on. Next slide, please. We talked about affordability, and here are some of the factors that we've considered. Perhaps the most important thing here is to zero in on the unique socioeconomic considerations of vulnerable communities or highly impacted communities, and to determine how the pricing and economics of our programs, how we design them, who can take advantage of them. All of these factors are considered. Next slide, please. And then on accountability, this obviously goes directly to PSC to make sure that there is a focus on the reduction of any harmful impacts, that there are metrics so that we are tracking and we are transparent in how we communicate the outcomes. And importantly, that we design programs that are not only designed for specific outcomes, but they consider and account for how the utility has considered equity as a component. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there are other examples of how equity has been approached. I'd say that the racial equity toolkit that you see before you is one that provides kind of a step-by-step approach. And they sort of use it as a pathway to checking through certain considerations. Our view is that that is one approach, but we're hoping that you give us your input on an approach that makes sense for you. Next slide, please. I mentioned also that the Department of Commerce for the state of Washington has developed a strategy. And at the middle of that strategy is equitable access. So what you see before you are a handful of examples of how other entities in the state are focused on equity. And this is a growing trend, not only in Washington, but across the country, where there is an emphasis placed on ensuring that communities are active participants in how these decisions are made and to provide feedback, constructive feedback on the best way to achieve those goals. Next slide, please. So today and going forward, we want to talk about the framework. The framework today will be focused on accessibility, as I've said. Going forward, we hope to have a similar conversation on affordability in October, and in November, we'll focus on accountability. And then in January, we will talk about how the 3 A's come together to promote a framework for equity on a broader scale. Next slide. So let me stop for a moment. I want to take a breath and give you an opportunity to let us know if any of these actions or any of the formatting that we're discussing makes sense. Are we missing anything? Is this a path that you would like to modify in any way? Or do you think we've captured your thoughts and an approach that makes sense? So I want to take a moment to do that. And again, today we want to talk about accessibility, but I'm just interested in your feedback on the path. So I want to stop and hear from you. Next slide. So as I've mentioned, the goal is to set a foundation for a framework toward our overall desired outcomes. The questions that we are raising for you is, there are 3. Who needs to be included? So who should we target? How should we frame our outcomes? What are our desired outcomes? And how do we, once we've established answers to questions 1 and 2, how do we actually accelerate equity? So what we're hoping is that you will advise us as a group on the actions that need to be taken to create the benefits and/or the steps that need to be taken to ensure that we either reduce or eliminate burdens for named communities. The actions relate to any necessary research or data collection, the identification of barriers, expanding communication, how we communicate, who we communicate to, elevating and encouraging more engagement, and then taking a look at the policies and the programs, and to make sure, again, around transparency, that there's room for evaluation to make sure that we are in fact hitting those goals. Next slide, please. So, on accessibility, we want to focus on the diversity of communities. We need your feedback on any specific areas around community needs. I recall quite specifically, the Korea and others mentioned the fact that we needed to be sensitive to language barriers. We needed to think about cultural considerations, and we needed absolutely to make sure that we included all of that in the way that we communicate, so that accessibility is a function of expanding how we connect with our customers, the community, and other stakeholders. So we're looking for your advice there. Next slide, please. Affordability and the notion of the economic impacts and both the benefits and the burdens will continue to be a part of the conversation. Next slide. Accountability sets forth the need to make sure, again, that we create trust, that the process is fair and understandable, and that there's a commitment to follow through. We've also discussed the need to measure outcomes and to identify the responsible parties and be clear on the relationships. Next slide, please. So as you look at how we framed or created this framework for language, as I mentioned, this is a placeholder based on feedback from you. Are there any areas specifically under accessibility that need to either be clarified? Do we have any gaps? Have we captured your thinking? If you take a moment to look at the box, we're just going to only look at accessibility for right now, and let us know your view on whether or not this is adequate. Who needs to be included? So who needs to be included? Here are our thoughts, and some of your comments are actually reflected here. So the community, specifying the communities that we're serving. Do we fully understand the community's makeup? And have we vetted their needs in all aspects of diversity? And again, the historic challenges and or barriers and other considerations for providing better access. So this is what we've thought about in terms of who needs to be included. Can we go to the next slide? And then for intended outcomes, increasing access to benefits. Here we also include a reference to better education. And then the next slide on acceleration. Here we speak to partnerships and leveraging those partnerships, the ability to identify trusted, authentic partners and parties to communicate. But this, I think, is where your comments, Dennis, would be reflected around committing resources and being very specific about the infrastructure. Any thoughts on this slide? Okay, oh, nice to see you, Demeco. Um, I'm going to turn it over to Brian for discussion on the portfolio benefits.
Okay, late evening, everyone. Everyone can hear me, I hope. Is nodding. Okay, good to see you all virtually. So really appreciate the dialogue before, because what I'm hoping is that the conversation we're about to have, we can tie in some of the pieces we just talked about for the accessibility for the equity discussion guide. But I'm first going to talk about portfolio modeling and resource planning. And in the end, again, hopefully we can weave these two together. So can we go to the next slide, please? So I'll touch on what we did last time. We talked a bit about customer benefit indicators, but today I want to do three things. The first is give you a very high level overview of resource planning, then talk about how we can use benefits, customer benefit indicators, but use benefits in determining which portfolio to move forward with in the resource planning process. Then at the very end, we want to talk about, okay, how in this resource planning process can we use this equity discussion guide? So those are the three objectives here. Again, the resource planning process is going to be pretty high level and try to keep it as simple as we can, just so we can have a bit of a dialogue towards the end about benefits and how the equity discussion guide can be tied in. A couple of caveats I want to make. We're not making decisions on resource planning today. These are all just illustrative proposals for us to have a conversation about how benefits can be used in the resource planning process. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Last time we talked a bit about customer benefit indicators. We talked about what they are, how we developed them, how they were developed with stakeholders, and then we provided a few examples. Today, we want to look at the application of indicators as it relates to the resource planning process. I keep saying resource planning process, but I promise you, I'm going to get to what that means and what all is entailed in that, because I know that's a new area. So I want to be sure that we've got a bit of understanding of what I mean when I say resource planning process here. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's go ahead, jump right into resource planning process. So you all have seen a version of this before. And I think last year and earlier this year, I talked a lot about how we developed the CEIP. We all know the CEIP is our 4-year roadmap for clean electricity, including the targets and actions. But what we don't talk about as much is the larger resource planning process, which is our IRP. Now, you may all have heard of the IRP before, the Integrated Resource Plan. That's our 20+ year sort of view of what we need to do in the long term. Now, the purpose of doing this resource plan is for us to model what could be and identify some needs in the long term. So for instance, we can run a model and it can tell us we're going to be short, meaning we don't have enough resources to meet our customers' needs in the year 2028. That may be something the model says. But we do that by first building out the model with a number of assumptions, inputs, things like that. I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. But I want to stay here just so we understand that what I want to talk about today is the 20-year look, okay? It's not the CEIP 4-year, it's the 20-year look, how we do the resource planning in the long term, so that we can think about what resources we need to require, what we need to bring in, how we can meet our customers' needs. Okay. The other piece I want to mention is that, again, this is about meeting load, meeting our customers' needs. And we do that starting from whatever period we start from and we go out 20 years. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. When we start building a model, there's some basic building blocks for that model, mostly around the resources. Now, these are the resources we could use to serve load, to meet customer needs, to meet demand, whatever it may be. Now, some of these you all have seen. I would assume maybe you've seen most of these. Large scale wind and solar, distributed rooftop. I think Dennis mentioned that earlier. Energy efficiency. I know, Emily, that's close to your heart. Energy efficiency, demand response programming, like a smart thermostat, energy storage, which is new and upcoming. So these are building blocks that we can use. We put in the model, let it turn, and then it comes out and says, okay, this is what we could use to meet the need later on in that process, okay? Now, here's another caveat. In the IRP process, these are generic resources. Now, generic resources just means we don't know specifically where, we don't have a specific project in mind. We are simply just saying, if we built a 300 megawatt wind facility in central Washington or in eastern Oregon or in Wyoming, these are some of the specifications it could have. And I want to stick on that point, because what we won't know in this resource planning process is how many customers are participating in distributed solar programming. We won't know which highly impacted or vulnerable population is this large-scale solar facility going to be in. Those things we won't know. But we recognize that those are things that would be very helpful to sort of have an understanding and make a decision from an equitable standpoint of how these resources impact the community around them and the customers that we serve, okay? So I just want to be clear that we don't have that level of detail in this process. That's something that would happen sort of later on, okay? Now, let's go to the next slide. The next couple slides, I'm going to talk a bit about before and after. So I think I've said this a number of times, that in the old version of resource planning, it was about what's the lowest cost, what's the lowest reasonable cost, meaning give me a mix of resources that allows me to safely and reliably meet my customers' needs, but at the lowest cost. Now with CETA, and we've talked a lot about this, now it's more than just cost. It's about all these other benefits that can be tacked on, that should be thought about as we make some of the resource decisions. So let's stay here and think about what we used to do in the integrated resource planning process. We gather a bunch of data, which means we get all our resources, all our hypotheticals, a bunch of input, like what's the load going to be in 10 years. We prepare the model. We come up with what we call portfolios. Portfolios is a key one, because I'm going to talk about portfolios later. But essentially, a portfolio is various scenarios. So we test various scenarios for ways to meet our customers' needs. We turn it through the model. It comes out and it tells us this is the cost for each of those portfolios. And then this may be a gap later on in future years. And so again, the old process was, how can we do this at the lowest reasonable cost? Okay, next slide. And a couple more slides, and we'll pause for questions. Now, same process, but what we're trying to understand, and this is where the conversation we have today will be really helpful, is we used to do it by just cost, meaning we would just look at a portfolio, typically lean towards the lowest cost, the lowest reasonable cost, and then move forward in that type of portfolio. Now, it's not just cost. We've got to think about other benefits like the ones I talked about in the meeting last time, talking about jobs, talking about participation, talking about reduction in greenhouse gas, public health, things like that. Those are the benefits we want to think about as we decide to choose a portfolio, okay? So now we get into the illustrations, the visuals here. So what I want to do in the next two slides is give some visuals, okay? Give some representation of what we mean when I say portfolios. Okay, let's go to the next slide, 43. Oh, There we go. Okay. So here we have, again, your generic resources. Those are the building blocks, and two different portfolios. We have a portfolio A and a portfolio B. Now, these are illustrative purposes only. These are not real portfolios. We put these together so that we can have a dialogue and discussion on what's in here and what the benefits are. So understand that these next two slides are just illustrative. Okay, so we could look at these two portfolios and say, well, in portfolio A, I get a lot of wind, I get a lot of solar, a lot of energy efficiency, not so much on the distributed or demand response side, right? We could also get another portfolio that meets our customers' needs, and we could have less wind, less solar on a large scale, but have much more distributed solar, much more demand response, and included some distributed storage as well. Now, I put these up because this is sort of a similar process that we at PSE do, where we've got these portfolios, where we have these sort of differences in the portfolios, and we have to understand why are these different. Historically, it would have been, well, which is the cheapest one? Which is the lowest reasonable cost between these two portfolios? But again, we're in a different atmosphere today where it's not just lowest cost, but we got to think about the other benefits as well. So let's keep these two in our mind, these two portfolios, A and B, okay? Now let's go to our next slide where we say, aha, now how can we apply some benefits to each of these portfolios, okay? Now again, the green is portfolio A, the orange is portfolio B, and instead of just cost as a benefit, now I can look at a portfolio and say, all right, well, how many customers do we think will participate in DER programming? Again, I don't know the specifics of the program. I'm just sort of guessing at what I think the number could be, because remember, in portfolio B had a lot more distributed solar and distributed storage versus portfolio A. I could also look at portfolio A and B and say, okay, how many jobs do I think I would get out of one portfolio versus another? Again, I don't have specifics, but maybe I could use some sort of proxy to come up with, well, there's a lot more distributed jobs, and so there were probably a lot more full-time and part-time jobs there. So I could look at that. Then I could look at environment and public health and think about, what does greenhouse gas reduction look like? Maybe I have more greenhouse gas reduction in portfolio B versus portfolio A, and I'll use some varying degree there as well. And then you'll see some of the cost implications and then some of the access to emergency power as well. And so what I want us to think about is, first is, does this make sense? The second piece is this idea that I presented here about looking at a portfolio and taking the totality of benefits and using that to really decide on which portfolio to use. Does that make sense? And it's really about, are we looking at benefits in the right way in this portfolio modeling process? I think I can stop here and ask for questions.